Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Michael Duffy, opinions editor at large at the Post. Jonathan Capehart has the week off. Our first guest today is Joseph Marks. He's the anchor of the Cybersecurity 202 newsletter at the Post. Good morning, Joe.
Morning, Michael.
Thanks for joining us. Let's talk about the Kaseya ransomware attack, which paralyzed hundreds of companies over the 4th of July weekend. You described this attack as a revolution, quote, in sophistication for ransomware hackers. What do you mean by that? Tell us about why this one is different.
Well, most of the time when you have attacks like this, they get in through really the lowest hanging fruit. Everyone remembers the Colonial Pipeline attack from, just a month or so ago. And in that case, executives there were sharing a password to get into a particular system. That password didn't have two-factor authentication. I mean, that's the kind of thing people have on their iPhones now. Pretty easy for the hackers to get in. In this case, the hackers used what's called a zero-day. That essentially means it's a bug in a computer system that has never been publicly disclosed before. It's never known to have been used to hack into anything before. This is the kind of thing that, big nation-state intelligence agencies, the NSA and the Kremlin use to steal each other's secrets. It's not something we've ever seen at this level before used to launch a ransomware attack against companies.
So it's sort of like amateurs using professional tactics?
Well, you can hardly call them amateurs anymore. I mean, some of these ransomware gangs, because they've taken in so much money from so many different places because people pay these ransoms, they have the budgets, the hacking budgets of a lot of nation states at this point, not the US level, not the Russia or China level, but like Pakistan, like Brazil. So, I mean, they're increasingly, not just professional, but, on the nation state level.
So who's behind it, and what does the evidence suggest about who's behind it?
So what the cybersecurity firms say is that the group behind it is a group called REvil. No one quite knows how to pronounce it. And that is a group that is based in Russia, run by at least Russian speakers, if not Russian citizens. The big question it seems that the Biden administration is working on right now is who paid for the attack. Because REvil is a ransomware as a service company, and so was DarkSide, the group that hit Colonial. So that's essentially, they've got the tools. They sometimes have the exploits to get into particular companies. Some group comes to them and says, hey, I want to use this against these guys for a big payday, and they supply you with the tools for it. It seems that the thing that the Biden administration is waiting on figuring out right now is, well, was the group who paid for it Russian as well? And if so, can we use that to push back against Putin somewhat more than we have so far? Or was it someone else? And to what extent does that actually matter?
So who paid for it as a test for the administration as opposed to some other measure? Is that the current yardstick the White House uses to decide how to respond, or are there other factors?
I don't think they have a yardstick yet. I think they're trying to figure out what their yardstick is. The one yardstick is how, to the extent to which the Russian state is responsible for this. It's widely understood that these groups are criminals. They're not operating out of the Kremlin, but they operate with, at the very least, the tacit approval and perhaps the active approval of the Kremlin that has not done anything to clamp down on them. The other issue is that when Biden confronted Putin about this in Geneva last month, the focus at that point was on critical infrastructure. These 16 large sectors that the government has determined, if there's a real attack in these sectors, that affects economic and national security. We need to do something about that. These are post 9/11 things that DHS came up with. Colonial Pipeline, that's definitely critical infrastructure. If there is a gas shortage across the United States, that's a really big problem. JBS, the meatpacking plant, that's another one. It's agriculture. If we had a real meat shortage, that would cause some panic in this country. The thing about Kaseya is it was really big. It affected up to 1,500 companies. But as far as we know, there wasn't this direct link to great American livelihood. So I think it's probably another thing that the White House is considering now.
So if critical infrastructure was not affected, the scope of this could change how the administration had been thinking about what sort of measured response it takes. Any indication yet about what that might look like? And would we as citizens know about it in real time days or weeks later, or is this something they won't talk about, do you think?
There are a number of different options on the table, and the question is, how much stomach does the administration have for them? This is a conversation between the U.S. and Russia that's been growing for some time. The things we have done so far, which include indicting Russian cyber criminals, indicting Kremlin-based hackers, and imposing sanctions on Russia, really haven't done a whole lot. There are much more severe and public things that we could do. Dmitry Alperovich, former CTO of CrowdStrike, now at Silverado Policy Accelerator, a thinker and expert in this field, wrote a post-op ed just last week, I believe, saying, hey, it's time to get serious. We need to, if Putin doesn't crack down on these companies, we need to impose very severe sanctions on the oil and gas sector. That would be a bridge we have not crossed yet. That could happen. We could punch back in cyberspace too. The problem with that is there are a lot of second and third order consequences when you do that. Certainly you could try to take out the ransomware gangs themselves. That's one approach, but that would be complicated, and you'd have to do it again and again over time. There are more severe things you could do. You could steal and release secrets about Putin and about his inner circle. You could do things that show we're very serious about this, that make Putin himself uncomfortable. The problem is cyberspace is about as asymmetric of a battlefield as you have. So once you've started to do that, you've made it easier for Russia to do the same thing back to us again, and they're pretty good at this. And also, we are, because U.S. companies are just much more dependent on the internet than Russian companies, if we get into a tit-for-tat exchange with them, we could be far more vulnerable.
One quick last question. As you look at this threat landscape, which seems to be, if not escalating, certainly getting more complicated, what are U.S. officials worried about that may come next? Do we know yet?
A lot of things are on the table. I mean, one would be if you can't get Putin to crack down on these criminal ransomware gangs, you really can't get him to do anything. Because on the list of things that should matter to Putin, this is not the top of the list. There are a lot of intelligence hacking operations that matter a lot more to the Kremlin than this. So if you can't do this, then our chances of managing anything diplomatically or through a pressure campaign are pretty limited. And then one of the big things, we have the 2022 midterms coming up. There could be a lot of chaos connected with those. And then the final thing that people have always worried about that we haven't seen quite as much of yet is destructive attacks, right? The Russians probably have gotten a foothold in a lot of this critical infrastructure, energy firms, dams, things like that. If rather than stealing information, locking things up, they decided to blow things up in the computer equivalent of that, that could be a real problem. If dams all of a sudden stop working, if energy plants are exploding, that's real, crossing the line into military conflict level.
Joe, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. We're out of time. Appreciate you taking time with us this morning, and good luck.
Thanks so much.
Now I want to bring in Washington Post contributing columnist Donna Edwards and editorial writer and columnist Chuck Lane. Welcome to you both. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
So, Donna, how aggressive has the president, or should the president be, towards Putin in light of what we just heard from Joe? Do you think that it's time for him to make good on his promises coming out of Geneva, or does it sound yet, so far, this isn't the moment?
Well, I mean, I think we're getting to that moment. And these cyber attacks are really, even if it doesn't affect critical infrastructure, it's costing millions of dollars. I was reading about the story of Leonardtown, Maryland, that was caught up in this ransomware attack. And, it's a small town, but it shuts down a town. It's a town that's near Patuxent Air Base that, impacts a lot of citizens. And so that may not be critical infrastructure, but I think the president has to look really aggressively about ways to both hold these criminals accountable, and clearly that's very limited. But going after their sources of money, and in some limited ways that we may not know about, going after these attacks and tracing them, if need be, making sure that we trace them to the Russian government or to government allied companies or something. But This is a really difficult one, but the cyber attacks have actually increased so substantially just over the last couple of years, and so we haven't seen an end to this. We've just seen an escalation.
Chuck, do you agree? How do you grade Biden's response so far?
I do agree with Donna that this is serious business and that it is escalating. And I think the president deserves some credit for laying down a marker to Vladimir Putin, but then obviously it's being tested, probably deliberately. And I think Putin's objective would be to show that Joe Biden is a weak president, that he can't protect the American people from an external threat. And that would be absolutely devastating to, in addition to all the other devastation, it would be devastating to this presidency. It's a reminder that very often people get elected president to do one thing, and then when they become president, a whole new challenge is presented to them that they really didn't campaign on, but that their presidency will, in some respect, be judged by.
Donna, yesterday, President Biden announced that the U.S.'s 20-year-long military commitment in Afghanistan will end by the end of, I think it's August. But the Taliban has made already some gains in the region, and the top U.S. commander there is concerned about further deterioration of stability in the country. Biden did something that the last three presidents couldn't do, which was actually end U.S. presence there. Is that the right move at the right time in your view?
Well, what I would say is it's about time. This 20-plus year engagement that we've had in Afghanistan after accomplishing what was an initial mission, it's been unclear over the last decade and a half of what the mission is in Afghanistan. And I'm conflicted about this, though. I think the plight and the status of Afghan women and girls under the Taliban is going to be a very, a huge step back from them. But the United States cannot solve a civil war and put the Afghans onto a path to their own governance. They have to do that themselves. And it doesn't mean pulling everything out of Afghanistan, the military mission, but the diplomatic mission will continue, the aid mission will continue. But I think it's about time.
Chuck, do you agree? Was the 20-year-long mission no longer enjoying public support, or was Biden just taking steps that no other president could manage to pull off here?
Well, I'm struck by how wide the consensus is in the United States to accept the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think nobody feels great about it. There's no good conclusion to this. There's no victory parade, even though, as Donna points out, our initial objective was achieved. The larger ones clearly were not. And I think the president, in a political sense, enjoys great protection here because he's carrying out Donald Trump's policy. President Trump wanted to get out of Afghanistan as well. And Biden, that's one of the few things they agreed about. I would say this, though, that if this process becomes extremely ugly extremely quickly, and we have images in the American and international media of terrible violence in Kabul, of people rushing to embassies to escape and so on, then the issue could change. And, again, the pressure could be on President Biden to re-enter Afghanistan, if only to protect from that terrible disaster. As Donna points out, a whole generation has grown up in Kabul of young people enjoying the freedom and particularly the gender equality that went on under the protection of the international forces there. And their fate is very, very grim right now.
Let's bring the focus home a bit. Congress is currently in recess, but there's a lot on the docket when they return, most notably infrastructure. A bipartisan group of senators has come close to an agreement on at least a first package of spending. Donna, after your time in Congress, do you think the Democrats can get it over the finish line before the end of summer?
Well, I think they can, but it's going to require an awful lot of work to make sure that they get that reconciliation package together, because without the budget reconciliation that gathers together spending that would deal with issues like climate change and the human infrastructure that's so important to moving the economy, that if that doesn't move, I don't see how you get all the Democrats on board for the infrastructure package. So those things, I think, have to move in tandem. Whether one comes right before the other or not, that's just a question of timing.
Chuck, in both houses, the Democrats have a majority almost in name only, a vote or two in one house, one vote in the Senate, less than 10 in the House. This narrows their leverage when it comes to negotiations. How do you see the prospects for infrastructure before the summer ends?
Well, I'm going to sound a little, I don't know from whose perspective, a little unduly optimistic or whatever, but I think when you really analyze it, the chances are probably better than even that the Democrats will come to accept this 1.2 trillion infrastructure or something very much like it, simply because when they really think about it, they all have to hang together, or in the 2022 midterms, they're going to all hang separately. Their chances of winning the midterms are not great to begin with. But to go to that election completely empty-handed, I think would be a political malpractice, and I'm sure the leadership in both houses understands that. Donna's absolutely right. Again, the political jujitsu that's going to have to be done to make that happen is not easy. But I think at the end of the day, the survival instinct will enable them to support some legislation.
And in the other big story on the Hill at the moment, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has now said that he will handpick some Republicans to join the commission that was started by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to look at the events surrounding January 6th. That was a step the Speaker took, as you guys know, after a more formal commission, which would involve people not in Congress, failed in the Senate. It's tough for McCarthy, though, because he has to pick people fairly soon, and the probe is going to look at whether not only what Donald Trump's role was, but also perhaps those of other GOP House members. That's a tough challenge. How do you think McCarthy will proceed, Chuck?
I think he's going to try to do as little as possible to break up his own group there in the House, and that's going to be hard. I guess what he'll probably try to do is find some of the more moderate members who either voted for impeachment or voted for some of these other anti-Trump, to authorize this commission and so forth, maybe put one or two of them on there. But, the problem for the Republicans is their base, people they depend on to get elected, doesn't care about this issue or thinks it was all Antifa's fault or something like that. I mean, the other risk is that they're going to find an honest investigation would find some links perhaps between sitting members of Congress and this mob. And that would be most untoward. Kevin McCarthy is desperately trying to run out the clock on this issue between now and next fall. At which point he expects the sort of inertia and momentum to carry him into the speakership, and then he can put the whole thing on ice for good, I would think.
You saw that Nancy Pelosi put Liz Cheney, the representative at large from Wyoming, on her commission. Is that a significant step, and what does that portend as far as you can see?
Well, I think the appointment of Liz Cheney was a class chess move, checkmate for Nancy Pelosi, because in this way, of course, this committee can't be accused of being totally partisan. There is a Republican on the committee, but at the same time, I think Kevin McCarthy is in a real bind here because the people who are most vying to be on the committee are the firebrands who are the biggest defenders of the former president, and he's going to have some mix of them on this committee or his caucus, I don't think will sustain it.
Yeah, yeah, Donna. If the commission actually gets itself together and they start hearing witnesses, should they subpoena Donald Trump to testify about what happened that day, and should Democrats fight for that?
Well, I'm not really sure yet that is necessary. I think that there's going to be enough subpoena of records and documentation and other people and a lot of video analysis that will support the fact finding. And if it comes to Donald Trump, I think that could actually just create chaos. And I suspect that Democrats are not going to treat this like the Benghazi commission. They are going to be serious about it. They're going to have their heads down, and they're going to be focused on getting to the truth and the fact finding. And the subpoenas will fall where they will, and probably to some members of Congress, but I really doubt that it will be Donald Trump.
Chuck, Donna spoke shrewdly there about the risks for Republicans in this. Are there any risks for Democrats in trying to pull off this commission's report before the 2022 elections? Any risks that you can see?
Not really, except possibly just using up bandwidth and members' time on something that, maybe later they would prefer to have the time for. But I honestly think that this is all upside for the Democrats in the following sense. Their base really cares about it. And in some sense, I think would punish them if they did not pursue this. And on the other hand, as you look ahead to 2022, the Democrats are going to need everybody in the base for that election. So I think politically, it's a no-brainer. But, this is one of those instances where the politics of the situation and the good policy also match up. I mean, we need the truth about these events. This was a horrible and unique, terrible moment in American history. It's extremely disappointing, I think, that more Republicans can't see that and that this has become so partisan.
Former President Donald Trump filed lawsuits this week against Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, YouTube and Google CEO Sundar Pichai after being removed from social media platforms. What's Trump up to here, Donna? What do you think the game is?
I think the former president is up to creating enough noise out there so that his base continues to pay attention, so that he can raise money, and so he can continue to point to what he describes as a fraudulent election. And that gives him, just kind of more energy and a bigger voice to do it, given that he's not on the platforms.
Someone wrote this week, Chuck, that for all his efforts to reestablish himself on Twitter and Facebook, the suit this week shows that Trump's preferred platform has actually always been the lawsuit. And so this is a return to his most familiar ground. Does that sound to you like it's right, or does he have some a reason to file this suit now, since most legal analysts have declared it to be specious?
I may surprise you guys by saying I think this ought to be taken a little more seriously than it seems that some people are. Not in a legal sense, because I agree that the legal basis of his suit is kind of weak. But in a symbolic sense, it's a little stronger than that. I mean, even Bernie Sanders is on record saying that it's a little awkward for these big companies to have the power to silence someone who, as objectionable as he may be, is the former president of the United States with a very large following in this country. And freedom of speech and freedom of expression are really core values in the United States, even for repugnant views. And this is an extremely controversial issue about which the margins of what should be permitted and what should not are very much open to debate. And I think in that sense, it's a shrewd position for Trump to adopt, to portray himself as the victim of these giant Silicon Valley corporations, which a lot of people don't like for other reasons. And, I think it would be a mistake to dismiss the symbolic potency of what he's doing.
You guys are great. So thoughtful, thought-provoking on all these things. Thank you so much for joining us. We're out of time. I want to thank both Donna and Chuck, as well as Joseph Marks. I'm Michael Duffy. Thanks for watching.